Morning. This is Mr. Reed coming at you live. Today we're going to start our first day of the Reader's Workshop model, and we're going to be covering our first of a few different concepts, this one being identity today, and we're going to be reading When Mr. Peraza Came to Dine, which is one of the short stories from the Interpretive Maladies. So let's quickly just talk about what the Reader's Workshop model is. Some of you who were here at the very beginning of the school year, you probably are familiar with this graph. I'll give you a moment to just kind of glance through this. But basically, the way that this is broken down is that the first couple of minutes of class is going to be a lecture style, kind of like what's going on right now. Where I introduce a new concept and I give you a couple examples, and then from there you move into your student-focused activity, right? Where basically you're checking out a novel that I've provided to you, which in this case is Interpretive Maladies. The first part of this is supposed to be just enjoyment of reading, right? Don't read it for the academic stuff. Just go ahead and just enjoy the text itself. And then roughly around the 20-minute mark, you'll probably want to go ahead and start getting into the concept that we are covering today and looking for examples, which then you will then post to your attendance work. All right. So within this period of time here, you're reading for pleasure at first, and then you're moving into a more serious academic read, and that's when I'm going to be getting in touch with you via your Zoom groups, which I'll show you in a minute. And that's an opportunity for you to ask some questions, and we can have some discussions about the text, or maybe it's discussions about the concept of identity itself. And then finally, finishing with some sort of closing activity, and that may vary from day to day here. Today, it's going to be examples of intertextuality, which means that I'm looking for examples of other text types that are more that are non-literary, that are maybe a little bit more contemporary, and we're looking for how identity presents themselves in this particular text. All right. So that will be a part of your attendance work as well. But this is an opportunity for you to do a little bit of reflection, kind of put a little punctuation on your understanding of identity. And of course, I'm here if you have questions. Let's talk about identity now. Identity, first off, as I mentioned in our last class, it's very complex, right? There's a lot to unpack with identity. Today, we're going to take things a little bit easy, and then we'll kind of, as we move through the rest of this course, we'll kind of start to build on our knowledge of this. So what exactly is identity? Well, when reading a text, students will encounter and interact with multiplicity of perspectives, right? Voices and characters. And what that means basically is that you have characters in a story with different opinions, okay? They share their own opinions, they have their own ideologies, they have their own cultural backgrounds that have an impact on how they view the world. We have a narrator who also has their own opinions and ideas, right? Maybe you have multiple narratives. And then finally, you have the author themselves. So last class, I had asked you to talk a little bit about Lahiri and how her culture influences how she writes. How does her identity shape the way she represents her characters? Okay. It is usually when reading and interpreting a text to assume that the views are to some extent representative of the writer's identity. Okay. Most likely, yes. However, the relationship between an author and the different perspectives and voices they assume in the text is frequently complex and makes the concepts of identity an elusive one, right? So this is kind of where things get a little bit more complex. I don't want you to stress out over this too much today, right? But just understand that when we talk about identity, not always you're going to have a writer, an author, who represents their own views and opinions in a text through maybe a character or characters, okay? So let's take a look at an example of identity here. I've pulled two examples for us to work at. So this is coming from the very beginning of Mr. Peraza Came to Dine. It says, Mr. Peraza won't be coming today. More importantly, Mr. Prasada is no longer considered Indian, my father announced, brushing salt from the cashews out of his trim black beard. Not since partition. Our country was divided 1947. When I said I thought was the date of India's independence from Britain, my father said, that too. One moment we were free, and then we sliced up. We were sliced up. So we have an opinion, right? Obviously, the way the father represents or talks about partition and the independence from Britain, right? The way he says sliced up, it's kind of negative. There's sort of a negative connotation there, right? Obviously, is entitled to his opinion, but just understand that clearly when he states this, that he clearly has an opinion about what happened in history during that time period, which is probably pretty negative. He also refers to Mr. Prasada not as Indian, but as something else, right? Now, I'm not saying that that's otherization or that's colonial mentality, but just note that one character is representing another character with a different identity than his own, even though they came from the same country, historically speaking, right? So right there and then, we have an opinion, we have an idea from one character about the sense of identity. The last thing that I want to talk a little bit about, right, is well, two more things, really. Does Mr. Prasada get to choose what his identity is in this piece, in this particular passage that I've highlighted? Well, when we think about it, not really, right? He doesn't get to decide if he's Indian or not, right? There's this thing called partition, right? If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's a really, historically speaking, a very interesting, I put quotations around that, but it's a very interesting moment in history. A lot of countries have gone through it. But it's something that is socio-economic. It's something that is political. So rather, Mr. Prasada doesn't get to choose his identity, but politicians and politics and society determine his own identity, not him. And then lastly, and this is all kind of interconnected, but we've talked about this in our last unit, the independence from Britain, right? Well, India was colonized, right? So the fact that India's independence, that breaking away from India, right? Again, something that's political, that's socioeconomic, that dictates what Mr. Prasada's independence is. He does not get to decide whether he's Indian or not now, right? So, big takeaways here is that obviously the author wants to present the way Mr. Prasada's identity through someone else who identifies as Indian, right? So there's a bit of a contrast, there's a bit of a binary between the opinion of the father, Mr. Prasada, on the sense of identity. But on a larger scale, just kind of like how we've talked about in the past with colonialism and how that dictates characterization and how that dictates identity. Well, that has a very important part of defining one's identity. Moving on. Lilia has plenty to learn at school, my mother said. We live here now. She was born here. She seemed genuinely proud of the fact as if it were a reflection of my character. In her estimation, I know I was assured a safe life, an easy life, a fine education, every opportunity, right? So in a lot of ways here, we have a character and a family that lived in the United States. There's sort of this idea of like, do we go back to India? Well, the answer is no, right? And although they may identify as Indian, right, the way the United States is being represented in this story, and you'll read more about this, it's seen as a safe space. It's seen as an opportunity, right? And so there's some larger questions about Lilia's own identity, whether she's seen as Indian, right, or if she's seen as American, right? And again, there's sort of the way the United States is represented in this text is seen as a safe area. There's a place where, again, she has a safe life, an easy life, a fine education, every opportunity, right? this is sort of what we call that American dream, right? That we saw in Leslie Tenario's More California, right? So again, expectations. So that may define Lilia's own sense of identity. I've shared this with you already, but just in case, you're welcome to check it out again. The first 11 minutes, if you just kind of need some background information on what the heck is going on in this story, because it's a kind of complex history behind the breaking up of India and Pakistan and then eventually Bangladesh. You're welcome to check this out. This is from Vox's Borders. It's a really fascinating TV show. The first 11 minutes just kind of gives you the history of it. Okay, so the next 40 to 50 minutes, feel free to watch this video again if you need to, but basically you're going to go ahead and just enjoy reading Mr. Prasada Came to Dine. The first 20 minutes or so is just supposed to be you enjoying it and just kind of taking it in, and then go back and then start answering these questions. Okay, these are 2 questions that will be on the attendance form. Do your best. Make sure that you pull examples from the text to help answer your questions. I'd like to see page numbers. And I will be checking in about 50 minutes into class just with your groups, which are right here. You guys remember these? Group 1, Group 2, Group 3. I'm going to be checking in with you guys on Zoom, so I'll either send you something on email or something in our Google Slides comment section just to see where you guys are at. If you have assistance, that's fine. Very last thing, the last 10 minutes, all right, is an active reflection. So what you've done here is the last 10 minutes, you get to choose between reading this Washington Post article about identity and language, or you can watch this video about the beauty pageant in the Philippines. And I'd like you to go ahead and just answer the one question for each one, depending on which choice you choose. So you have option 1 and option 2. All right, attendance work is right here. Again, feel free to ask me questions, and have a good one.